Welcome to today's webinar, Mapping Out Oncology Development, Filling Gaps and Avoiding Pitfalls. We're excited you could join us. My name is Megan Billingsley, and I'll be moderating today's event. Today, we'll be doing a deep dive into how sponsors of oncology therapies can optimize their development planning for commercial success. We are thrilled to be joined by our speakers, Dr. Mark Pipus, Senior Medical Director at Roe, Dr. Joseph Watson, Director of Regulatory Strategy at Roe, and Dr. Kevin Barber, Senior Vice President, Regulatory Strategy and Submissions at Roe. Before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping items. Please note the slides will advance automatically throughout the presentation. To enlarge the slides, click the Enlarge Slides button located in the top right corner of your presentation window. If you need technical assistance, click on the Help widget located on the bottom left corner of your console. We encourage you to submit questions at any time throughout the presentation using the Q&A widget at the bottom of your console. We will try to answer these during the webcast, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. Please know we do capture all questions. So to kick us off, I'd like to ask each of our speakers to provide a quick introduction of themselves and their work. Mark, would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you. Dr. Mark Pipus. I'm a medical oncologist, and I am Senior Medical Director at Roe Incorporated.
Wonderful. And Joseph, could you tell us about yourself?
Joseph Watson. I'm Director of Regulatory Strategy at Roe and have worked on many NDAs, INDs in the past. Looking forward to chatting with all of you.
It's great to have you. And Kevin?
Yes, hi, I'm Kevin Barber. I'm Senior Vice President of Regulatory Strategy and Submissions at Roe. I've been in the business about 25 years, and I regard myself as a bit of a regulatory generalist, so I'm really excited to be here today with Mark and Joseph to talk specifically about oncology development.
Fantastic. All right, we will get right to it. So to kick us off, I'd like to start by asking you about some of the trends going on here with respect to oncology drug development. We know that the science has advanced tremendously in just the past few years, and at the same time, cancer drugs are facing many challenges. So could you walk us through what's going on? And Mark, we'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. Well, this is an interesting slide showing trends in drug development. And as you can see at the bottom in green, oncology is the lowest in terms of percentages of drugs in research and approval. I think that this graph doesn't do justice to what's happening in clinical oncology research in 2023. We know that since about 2003, there have been almost 125 new cancer drugs approved, and those have been approved in nearly 375 indications. This includes a couple of CAR T therapies and a number of drugs in different classes, including immune regulatory, cytotoxic, and particularly in targeted mechanism, which accounts now for about 2/3 of all oncology approvals. We know that about 40% of all research worldwide is now in oncology, and oncology approvals account for about 85% of accelerated drugs coming in through the accelerated approval pathway through the FDA. So this is an area that will be increasing in importance, and while the numbers of approvals seem to lag behind what happens with other areas, we know that there are huge unmet medical needs, and that as we have an increase in our understanding of the translational science, basic science, and those disciplines overlap, that more targeted, more effective therapies will come forward. And the challenge, I think, for many different parties at this point is how to optimize the drug development process to ensure that your active agent meets with FDA requirements for approval and for marketing.
Yeah, and I think, Mark, elaborating on that further again, knowing that the success for oncology products lags a bit behind some of the other therapeutic areas, that's definitely one of the things we're focusing on as we go through the discussion today, talking about the unique and interesting challenges that developers face in the oncology domain. A lot of factors coming into play across the product quality that comes into consideration, comparisons with the standard of care and demonstration of efficacy for an oncology drug, considerations around the regulatory requirements with FDA and other regulators. How much data are they looking for? What is ultimately the bar across all of these domains? And going from early phase development all the way through to late phase development and marketing applications. Even if you look at what's available within complete response letters for oncology products, there's a lot of responses from FDA that you don't have sufficient quality data to approve the product, even though there may be enough efficacy data. There's also findings from FDA in a complete response letter that you need to go back and do another trial, which begs the question of how well was the clinical program conducted to support that marketing application in the first place. So there's a lot of things that can come into play across all stages of development that impact the risk in oncology drug development and the probability of success for a given program.
And Kevin, I'll play off that a little bit. The rapidity that a sponsor will seek in trying to develop an oncologic product it can sometimes be a hindrance, because a lot of people take on this idea that our product is going to help people, it's going to make people well, but there's still a bar that FDA is imposing on getting that drug approved. And that bar isn't necessarily just inches above the ground. There are activities that have to take place, and you're alluding to them in your comments in CMC, in pharmacology. If you think about exposure and coming up with an appropriate exposure relative to an efficacious signal, all in all, you have to consider your entire program, or you end up in a space where you're not actually ready to seek approval, even if you have some efficacy data.
Excellent. Thank you. Great conversation. And as you said, it is possible to successfully develop an oncology drug product. And we've addressed some of the challenges to getting there. But how do you do it? What are the factors that can lead to success? Joseph?
Generally, it's about planning. This is a lot like other indications in some ways. You've got to lay out your development program. We always talk about an integrated product development program from start to finish. And my mentor originally taught me this important maxim of begin with the end in mind. So start with what your target goal is and walk your way back and think through what you need to fill in as you're developing your product. Ultimately, that will help you get there more rapidly than if you just start with an idea and begin developing from the initial phases. In general, you want to start with, understand the underlying biology of what you have. Part of that is really getting into the mechanism, understanding why your product should work in the space that you're examining. Begin early phase planning, move on to later phase planning, and then when you get past later phase planning, which involves lots of conversations with the regulatory authorities, move on to your phase 3, where you actually start to gather your data and present it so that you, in such a way that you can seek approval.
Yeah, and again, go ahead, Mark. Go ahead.
If I can just jump in with that, I think add to what Joseph is saying, not to cut you off, Kevin. In terms of opportunities for success, the slide that we've got, I think we can't overemphasize the understanding of basic biology. Really clearly defining the mechanism of action of drug, and then as you move into early phase planning, understanding, whether as you run your phase 1 study, whether you're looking for a maximum tolerated dose or a maximum biologic effect, and those are not always the same thing, particularly now as we move more into the realm of biologic agents and targeted therapies. And not taking shortcuts in that, and equally important, critically important, is identifying your target patient, not only in terms of the disease that you're targeting, but any molecular abnormalities within that disease that can enrich your population, and then further, what stage and what phase of the disease cycle are you targeting? Are you targeting early patients, later patients? There's a natural tendency in oncology development to bring drugs into very late stage patients, patients who've exhausted all standard of therapies. But again, the danger, the risk for that, of course, is that you will undervalue and underappreciate the potential efficacy that will come with that agent. And all of these then should be done in concert with, as Joseph mentioned, that forward-thinking, late-phase planning for your registration-enabling program.
Yeah, and what I was going to elaborate on, Mark, in line with what you and Joseph are speaking to is, challenges that FDA as a regulator recognizes that come into play include, it's one thing to understand the mechanism of action, the drug activity, what you can see non-clinically, and perhaps in pharmacodynamic effects in early clinical studies, but ultimately going from there to demonstrating the clinical benefit against the standard of care in the patient population is very challenging for this. And then likewise, the dose optimization, you touched on it a bit, talking about, MTD or the right doses to take into a phase 2 or an adequate and well-controlled study to serve as a pivotal trial. FDA is really paying attention to that as well. And we can talk about that as we go through this today and discuss the different phases of development. But the bottom line is, key to all of this is listening to the feedback from FDA and FDA's regulatory perspective on this, given the totality of the development programs that FDA deals with across the industry, and the feedback that they give to us as developers across each of the disciplines. It's really key to listen to them. And that's some of the challenges that sponsors run into, is really paying attention to what FDA is telling them and utilizing that to understand the clarity that they need to have for their development programs. So again, all of these are important points to keep in mind to try to optimize the chances of success, reduce the risk, and avoid some of the common errors that might pop up in an oncology program.
And Kevin, on that, it's not, you don't have to necessarily capitulate to everything FDA initially tells you. You can make logical arguments with the agency, and they will listen to you and then give you a decision. And oftentimes there will be a compromise reached if you have a logical argument for why you can't do something. But I wanted to go back a little bit to Mark's statement on the molecular mechanism of action and how, with these targeted cell therapies, et cetera, that we are currently developing, the science can be known even better than it used to be known. And so being able to explain that to the agency is one of the key pieces to get you started. But as you move through and start to think about, does this work in humans? You've got it working in a model system, you've got it working in cell culture, you've got it working in whatever. The FDA's, they'll recognize that, but the proof is in the pudding, I guess. So you basically have to actually show efficacy, like you were emphasizing. And that's where the risk is and the benefit, and ultimately the outcome that you're taking a risk in that space, because the non-clinical outcomes won't necessarily translate to clinical. But people do it all the time, and we've gotten multiple approvals in years, as Mark was pointing to. So I anticipate, again, this is something that can be overcome.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think, again, understanding the mechanism of action that you're moving forward with, and really being prepared to defend that mechanism of action, and then picking the appropriate population for your study is the critical step there, right? And I think one of the big things that's important, I think it's easy, especially for small companies with a new agent, people dedicate a huge amount of their life to development of drugs in the preclinical space. I've watched that in my career, seen very bright PhDs put enormous energy into developing a drug, developing a platform. It's easy to fall in love with your baby. And I think that it's very important as companies move from the preclinical and translational space into clinical medicine to be sure that they're getting buy-in from clinicians, to pressure test their thought process with clinical oncologists. And I think that's something that's really critically important and sometimes minimized a bit. Getting a group of key opinion leaders, getting a group of scientific medical advisors into a room and discussing the thought process for how you want to move forward, this is a really good way to bring it down to the real world. I think that you have to understand what standards of care already exist in the space that you're going into, and why, if you're going to be moving forward with a new agent or a new platform, that will be better, why it will fit in, and then understanding those nuances in oncology between different stages, different phases of the treatment lifetime for patients. And again, ensuring that where you're going with this drug optimizes your chance of success. I think it's important to recognize that the FDA is not our enemy. The FDA is our ally, and it's a tremendously highly functioning agency. They want this to work. They want drugs to work. They want patients to be better. We know that about 85% of all accelerated approvals now are occurring in oncology, and I think that's proof that the process can work. But I think that, it's important that we do our homework going forward and prepare for robust clinical design and clinical program moving forward at the outset.
Mm-hmm. On that, Mark, you're making me think specifically of beginning with the end in mind. What are you trying to achieve at the end? What if your product is no better than what's already on the market? What's the viability for your product? So that's one of the key pieces too. FDA in this space is looking for something that does better than the standard of care. So you can't be just a duplicative or even like maybe a little bit less good than the standard of care. You're looking for an improvement.
Yeah. Right, I think that's very important. I think there's also a separation here, and I'm speaking as a clinician, between statistical significance and clinical relevance, and those are not always the same. They're not always the same bird. And I think, again, you have to show not only a benefit mathematically, but a benefit in real time for what this agent will do for the patient, and how you can convince patients' families and treating oncologists that this drug has a real role in the management of cancer.
Mm-hmm. And on that too, Mark, I'm thinking about biomarkers and how oftentimes those are used to as a surrogate for a real endpoint. And then you might not see an improvement in overall survival or some other outcome that you're examining, and how it's important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and I think there's a huge emphasis on biomarker-driven studies, and again, that's a really important thing. And again, it speaks to our understanding of basic science and our knowledge in translational medicine. But we also know that biomarker-driven studies are not necessarily better. Response rates, duration of response may be improved, but other endpoints in biomarker-driven studies generally have not, and that includes overall survival. So I do think that it's important to keep that in mind as the drug development process goes forward.
I think that this is a great discussion, and there's a lot being uncovered here. I'd like to go back to something that Joseph said a little while ago about the comprehensive roadmap, and maybe unpack some of what you said step by step. So what should sponsors understand about early phase planning, both understanding the mechanism of action, but also dosing and formulation considerations and other pre-IND implications? Joseph?
Yeah, again, I've emphasized a little bit the mechanism of action. That's your first step. Just make sure you have a good proof of concept. That's in vitro and in vivo animal work as you're beginning to move into humans. So in that early phase development in pre-IND, you want to actually ensure that your product is ready to go and that you're convinced that there's a chance that it might work in humans. On top of that, you've got to consider safety, and that's where your toxicology data come into play. Even if you see an effect, if the toxicology data that you're viewing is pretty negative, you're going to start to question whether there's a benefit to patients when you actually start giving it to people, if FDA even allows you to move forward with that. So in general, early phase focuses on preclinical, as we all know. Looking at biomarkers are important, coming up with an assessment of whether there's a benefit versus the risk that we've been discussing. The type of formulation you're going to use. One thing is, is your formulation adequate in specifically, can you give the formulation at varying doses and detect those changes in dosing when you actually look at the PK within your animals? If not, maybe your formulation isn't acceptable. Maybe you don't really have a good formulation that can actually be given to people and followed appropriately so that you can tell what dose level is necessary for it to act. These are just some of the considerations. Mark, Kevin, anything you have on your mind?
Yeah, I can jump in here. And, again, when we're talking about early phase development, pre-IND, early phase 1 development, again, the goal here is enabling the first in human studies for a product. And so, as Joseph said, understanding the mechanism of action, having the appropriate non-clinical toxicology package to enable that first study is important, and knowing what doses to look at. But then part of the key challenge as well in early phase development, and thinking about sort of phase gating, whether to move into a phase 2 study or future safety efficacy studies, is again, running the right studies in that phase 1 domain to determine the appropriate doses to take into the next phase of development. So there's a lot of things you're looking at, obviously, on the clinical pharmacology side of things, to leverage what you know about the mechanism of action to try to optimize chances of success. And where we've seen some programs go off the rails in early phase development is not doing enough in that early phase domain, not doing enough of the clinical pharmacology studies, the dose ranging studies, the dose optimization studies that FDA would expect to allow you to proceed into further later stage development. Hand in hand with that, again, you can't forget about the CMC side of things. A lot of these novel cancer therapies today are not, of course, just small molecule products. They are pretty complicated, advanced biologic products, monoclonal antibodies, cell therapies, gene therapy products. And, the tendency, of course, and the need is to continue to improve on those as you move forward through development. But you need to make sure that you are taking into the clinic relatively mature versions of these so that you don't run into problems with having to bridge back to earlier formulation. So all of these come into play in an integrated development program. And that's key, as Joseph mentioned earlier, about the roadmap through your early phase development to late phase development across all of these disciplines, and understanding the interplay of all the moving parts for an overall development program. But I'll stop there. Mark, is there anything you wanted to comment on?
No, I think I agree completely with what you're saying. I don't know, Kevin, if you wanted to touch on the accelerated approval pathway at all with this discussion, because it is a clinical pathway that I think is important and that I think we get frequently asked about when talking with companies bringing new drugs forward.
Yeah, and we can talk about that. As you mentioned, a very high proportion of oncology drugs make up products that are approved under the accelerated approval pathway by FDA here in the United States, and a large proportion of the oncology approvals themselves are under the accelerated pathway. Again, at the end of the day, what FDA is looking for is, and you noted this a bit earlier, Mark, a statistically significant difference on a clinically meaningful endpoint. And so when we're dealing with accelerated approval, when we're thinking about surrogate endpoints that come into play for accelerated approval, it comes down to looking at the right endpoints. And FDA has some good guidances out there about what endpoints are acceptable in lieu of overall survival, which of course is the end game. And so looking at either the tumor-related endpoints, such as progression-free survival, disease-free survival, variations on response rate. Those are all viable endpoints to consider. But ultimately, you need to leverage your early phase development to help you refine the data to justify going to FDA to propose an accelerated approval pathway using one of these surrogate endpoints. So it still very much comes down to doing the right studies initially. And again, that's where a lot of developers get into trouble, is trying to rush into phase 3 studies without doing some of the necessary early phase work to inform both negotiations with FDA around accelerated approval, as well as ultimately the design of the right studies in the later stage development to support a marketing application.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important point. And there was a very fine article published this fall in the JCO by Richard Pazder and his colleagues in the oncology branch at the FDA. And they made some clear points about, idealizing the development process with accelerated approval in oncology. And one of the things they really talked about was that before a sponsor embarks on an accelerated approval plan, they should conduct adequate dose optimization studies and activity finding studies, so that the accelerated process was never intended as a way to skip bases. You still have to run those bases. You can do it in a faster fashion, perhaps, but you still have to document all the necessary steps towards drug approval. We know that the most frequent endpoint that's seen in an accelerated approval process in oncology is the overall response rate, and that's a very important endpoint, right? It's critically important to patients and families in the clinic. You know, if grandma's tumor is getting smaller, everybody's really happy, right? But that doesn't necessarily equate to survival outcomes, and we know that that's been the case many times in the past, particularly in solid tumor oncology. And we know that the FDA really has insisted in general that for a full approval after an accelerated approval, you're really looking at that, as you mentioned, the survival endpoint, either overall survival or in appropriate situations, progression-free survival, where there's a close correlation between PFS and OS. And the FDA, in fact, in that position paper that was published in the JCO in the autumn, that the FDA really recommended that confirmatory trial be underway or even completed at the time of an accelerated approval is granted. That's not always the case. Obviously, there are tremendous time and financial pressures, particularly for smaller companies. But in an ideal world, that enrollment process would be completed so that a full approval could be granted. We know that the full approval process it currently takes close to 4 years on average for oncology agents, and even longer if in those rare cases where the full approval is withdrawn. In the meantime, we have a degree of uncertainty, which is not good for anyone. It's not good for the companies, but it's particularly not good for the patients and for the doctors who are treating them.
Mark, I liked what you said about you still have to do a full development program. You know, the accelerated approval piece is really focused on the phase 3 piece. Building up to that, you should understand your drug, you should understand its effect on your population. And instead of, one problem I've seen is that people come in not understanding the drug, not yet understanding how it acts in their population, and want to go straight to a phase 2/3, which they're wanting to use for approval as soon as possible. And so getting that phase 2 data, looking at patients, looking at the duration of response, looking at overall response rate, putting that all together, thinking through what the impact on overall survival will be based on how long you can reduce tumor growth is one of the key aspects of development. And you can't just get past that and assume you're going to see the phase 3, or you're wasting a lot of money and time.
Right. Now, I think there is an exception to that, Joseph. And I think one of the important things to remember that approval in oncology drugs, about a third of oncology agents are approved based upon phase 2 studies, single-arm phase 2s. Those are the exceptions, and those are generally in very rare diseases. I mean, you think, obviously, the first thing that would come to mind is the rare pediatric cancers. You know, there are pediatric diseases where there's only 100 or 200 cases a year in North America. Obviously, it's next to impossible to do a phase 3 randomized study in that situation. So there are situations where the FDA would consider an approval based upon a single-arm study, especially in patients with high unmet medical need. Just very recently, the FDA approved a RAF/MEK inhibitor in pediatric low-grade gliomas, and based upon a very small trial. But again, that's the individualization of the clinical development pathway. And that's something that needs to be thought about very actively and realistically at the start of the development process.
I get what you're saying, Mark. Go ahead, Kevin.
No, I was just going to jump in and following on what Mark was saying. I mean, again, that's that intersection of oncology and quite frankly, orphan or rare disease development across the board. There are circumstances where FDA can be very flexible in the totality of the data that they need to approve a product. And that flexibility comes into play in the rare, orphan disease setting. But quite often in oncology, they still expect confirmatory data, and so again, it's going to depend on the space that you're in and the particular indication that you're driving towards as to whether you can leverage a smaller phase 2b type study, as opposed to doing perhaps more traditional confirmatory, adequate, well-controlled trials, as would other drugs in other therapeutic areas.
Yeah, and you still need that formulation prep work. The early stage, getting things together, understanding your exposure, understanding the how your drug is working in people. So you can't skip past that, even if you are approved on a phase 2. That is again based on, as you're noting, the orphan drug intersection, which there's always some flexibility, particularly if your drug just happens to do do amazing. How's that? Then potentially there's an approval at phase 2, but you still need to understand your formulation in order to give a rational argument to the FDA and to justify your dose that you're giving the patients.
Excellent. There's a lot of great insights here. I do want to move on to the next part of that roadmap that Joseph had mentioned, which is end of phase planning. What are some best practices to note there? Kevin, we'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah. Again, end of phase, sort of phase gating, sort of no-go decision considerations always come into play. And in order to be ready to move on to that next phase of development, a lot of in the oncology domain, there's opportunities to go and ask for an end of phase 1 meeting with the FDA to get clarity from the FDA that they agree that you're ready to run, appropriate phase 2 and eventually pivotal studies to support the development of your product. So this is where you have to be really self-critical. You have to look at what you have. You have to basically put yourself under a microscope, do a gap assessment appropriately, determine whether you do in fact have enough data to support the proposed phase 2 dose, for example. Do you have enough pharmacokinetics, exposure data? Do you have enough data on the pharmacodynamic side of things with potential efficacy effects of the product? Have you generated enough safety data to think about the toxicities of these therapies in the oncology domain? FDA is going to take all of that into consideration as they give you guidance on whether you are in fact ready to proceed to the next stage of development. So it is critical to put on your regulatory hat and look at the totality of the data that you have in order to inform the next stage of development, because this is where studies start to get more and more expensive. As you go from phase 1 to phase 2 to larger, adequate, and well-controlled studies, you're putting in a lot of resources into this, and you want to optimize your chances for success and understand the relative risks. So what's the probability of success when all is said and done? And hand in hand with that, you need to continue to move through on the non-clinical side of things and on the CMC front to get, Joseph alluded to this, you need to make sure that your formulation is truly ready, that you're not going to be making major changes in your product from this stage forward that are going to impact the extent to which FDA and you can rely on the clinical data that you produce. So things need to be relatively advanced in order to make the right go decisions as you move into the next phase of development. Joseph, there's probably more that you could comment on related to this.
About is the idea of efficacy and convincing yourself that you're ready. How do you convince yourself you're ready to move forward? And part of that is controlled by the agency. They expect for a controlled study for you to have a plan in place before you unlock your data and view it. What we found a lot of times is that data that come in at this phase 2, early confirmation data, early data that is meant to convince you to move forward into phase 3, that those data aren't exactly what you were hoping for. It can be maybe you didn't hit a p-value and you have a lot of rationales why. Everybody digs into the data, examines it heavily, and you come up with a subgroup that is within that population that does hit a p-value. And that acts as your go, no-go choice. That's what you push for efficacy to allow you to move into phase 3 and begin spending a lot of money on clinical studies that maybe you're not quite ready for because you missed something in the phase 2 program. And that's something we see quite often, that if you you should step back and consider whether moving forward that rapidly is the best thing to do when you have data. Convincing yourself of a signal that's produced from a post hoc assessment is often dangerous, is what I'll say.
Yeah. Maybe I can follow up on that, Joseph. I think that's a really important, an incredibly important point. There's a huge impetus, right, to want a program to succeed, especially after you've gone into the clinic, you've gone through phase 2 study, you've put 25 patients on it, 100 patients on it, and your primary endpoint has not been met. So then there's this tendency to start digging into the data and doing these post hoc analyses to look at these subgroups until you can delude yourself into the idea that there's an efficacy signal that maybe really is not there. I think on a personal level, I was involved in a pancreas trial a few years ago with a JAK inhibitor where this exact thing was done. The primary endpoint in phase 2 was not met. And then we moved into a phase 3 study based upon a post hoc subgroup analysis, which, in retrospect, is bound to fail. And unfortunately, it failed. There are real patients, there are real families who are involved in these kinds of things. And I think the important takeaway point is before you start embarking on a subgroup analysis or cherry picking your data, that you get involved with a very good biostatistical group and you let them start to look at these data in an objective fashion before trying to convince yourself that you're ready for prime time. And it goes back to this whole idea of planning, right?
Yeah. And Mark, what you're touching on is, I hate to use the term, but it's almost classic. In the course of my career, I've been able to observe many sponsors who fail a study and then do post hoc analyses and decide to proceed at risk with a phase 3 study, for example, not just in oncology, but across different therapeutic areas. And there are always incredible risks associated with that. And that is actually one of the reasons why a lot of pivotal studies, adequate and well-controlled studies, ultimately fail, because they were not sufficiently informed and decisions were made to proceed to very expensive studies without doing the earlier preliminary work. For better or for worse, it's better to go back a little bit to the drawing board and reassess where you are with your program and find out if you're really moving in the right direction when you run into some of these circumstances and a study fails, instead of trying to convince yourself and cherry pick the data as you described. But it happens, and that's why big phase 3 studies ultimately end up failing. So again, to your point, you need a good statistician, and you also need a darn good clinical pharmacologist to help you understand whether you're even looking at the right dose, because these studies fail to a great extent because the wrong dose is selected.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, the old axiom is that most oncology drugs don't fail because they don't work. They fail because the program wasn't right. And I think there's a great deal of truth to that. You need to understand whether the drug is absorbed differently if you're eating or you're not eating, whether you're giving it once a day or twice a day. Does that mechanistically change the effect against the tumor cell? There are many, many things that need to be considered in this process. And as Joseph said, there may be times when you need to go back to the drawing board. That's very difficult to do in the heat of battle when you want to march forward with a development program that's very time oriented. That you may need to take a pause and you may need to back up and try to understand if you can do something differently before committing to that $20 or $30 million clinical phase 3 study.
Yeah. Just speaking of that real quick, first of all, exposure. You need to understand your therapeutic dose as much as you can and ensure that's what your patients are getting so you have the best shot of succeeding. That's why we go back to the formulation development. You need to make sure you're within that target range of, AUC is most likely where you're aiming for, right? But just to make sure you're there. And then secondly, I worked on one program where a sponsor failed their phase 3. They did a post hoc analysis, ran another phase 3. They failed that phase 3 with that subgroup. They did another subgroup analysis. another phase 3 and failed that phase 3. So I'll say, you really need to a priori plan. And going back, staying in phase 2, staying at a smaller proof of concept study might get you there faster than throwing money at phase 3s.
Excellent points. I think that we've covered well what to do once you're in phase 2 to get us to that phase 3 point. So now let's talk about that late phase planning. What are your tips for sponsors there? Joseph?
Yeah, so this is where you take everything that you have learned and try to put it together and come up with a rational plan for how you're going to get approval. You should take the precedent for drugs in your class. You should research, come up with a good plan, present it to the agency at your end of phase meeting, ensure that you're ready to move forward with a phase 3 design that FDA more or less agrees with, and then utilize that. And this is where you roll the dice. You've convinced yourself your drug works. Now you have to prove it. And make sure you have your enrollment in place, have your statisticians help you to ensure you have your study properly powered. Have your clinical experts examine the protocol to make sure you're not leaving out some key assessment that's necessary for you to be able to show that your product is working. Make sure you're not enrolling the wrong people. All of this should have come to fruition through your phase 1 and phase 2 planning, where you see what impact your drug has on the appropriate population, and you learn more about how your drug should work. And so it helps you understand what your population and the size of your population should be in order for you to show that your drug is working.
Yeah, I think an important part of the end of phase planning to move into your pivotal studies, your phase 3 studies is, and I'm the regulatory guy, so I'll keep talking about listening to the FDA, but it is a matter of looking across every comment that FDA has ever given you in your development program, from pre-IND all the way through to the current stage of development, and determining whether you've addressed that adequately in your development program. Are you truly ready to move into a phase 3 paradigm and generate the data to support the future marketing application? And are you ready for that marketing application to come? And what gaps do you need to fill during, this late stage of development in parallel with your adequate, well-controlled studies to support the marketing application? What do you need to fill in the other disciplines? This is where a lot of sponsors perhaps have ignored clinical pharmacology. They've ignored, considerations around drug-drug interactions, extrinsic and intrinsic factors, other things that FDA does not set aside just because you're in the oncology domain. They're still expecting that you will flesh out and provide adequate data to inform a label. At the end of the day, what you're getting FDA to approve is not just the product itself, but the prescribing information that goes along with it, the instructions for the physician and for the patient in terms of how the product's going to be used in the commercial domain. So they still expect the totality of information to fully inform such a label, even though you're in the oncology field working with very sick patients, working with very serious diseases. They don't lower the bar in that regard. So a really important part of planning and execution for a successful late phase development program leading into the marketing application is to go through all of those and make sure that you're addressing them appropriately and that you're truly ready to file that marketing application when you have successful data coming out of a pivotal trial. Joseph and Mark, I don't know if you have any other comments around that.
I think that's great. That summarizes it very well, Kevin.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. There has been so much great discussion, lots of things being uncovered, and I know that you probably have amazing takeaways and even tips to share, but in the interest of time, I would like to jump into some audience questions here just to make sure that we can get through some of these. So our first one here asks, do you expect the FDA to ever approach NDA, BLAs a little less rigorously in the future, or will it always be this challenging to push through to approval?
I can start with this one. Short answer, no. As I just mentioned, again, at the end of the day, what FDA is looking for is enough data to develop appropriate prescribing information for how a product is going to be used, and they're not going to take shortcuts in doing that, even though you may be in an area with serious life-threatening diseases such as oncology. I think where FDA, I think evidence of that comes into play in terms of what FDA has referred to as Project Optimus, which is guidance and an initiative on the part of FDA's Oncology Center for Excellence around making sure you have the optimal dose as you go through phase 2 and phase 3. They're asking for more data now, not less, not fewer data, in order to inform the right doses to carry forward. It's not just around the maximum tolerated dose anymore, especially for some of the more advanced oncology therapies that are coming out, monoclonal antibodies, cell therapies, kinase inhibitors, et cetera, as opposed to just strictly, cytotoxic small molecules. So FDA is asking for more, not less, when it comes to what they expect throughout the course of a development program and informing a marketing application. And at the end of the day, where they try to be helpful to industry to advance products is bringing their resources to bear. I mean, they've got a real-time oncology review initiative that's in place now to try to speed up review of applications. There's expedited pathways that most oncology products qualify for, where FDA brings resources to bear to support sponsors in development and to engage with sponsors to help guide them through development. So the initiatives from FDA are not in the direction of less rigor, but in the direction of more data is better from FDA's perspective, and engaging with these companies that develop these products in these challenging but really important areas such as oncology.
Yeah, look, maybe I can follow up on that. When I started in oncology in the early 1990s, there were only about 30 or 40 drugs around. The science was very loose. A lot of it was non-scientific in its approach. And a decade ago, the word translational medicine barely existed. I think as translational science moves forward, as we gain a truly deep understanding of cellular mechanisms and pathways, the FDA rightly will expect that you have that science applied to your agent, that you intimately understand the mechanism of action, you intimately understand the toxicity profile, and that you're prepared to show that in a cohesive fashion. The FDA is a very they're not politicized, but the environment, of course, in our country has become very politicized, and FDA has not been immune to that. They're under a great deal of pressure to perform properly, right? Again, they're not our enemy. They want these drugs to come forward, but they're going to have an expectation that everything is done properly. And I would agree very much with Kevin that the approach will not get less rigorous ever. The approach will become more rigorous, more science-based, and more precise. And I think rightly so. I think we owe that to our patients, and we owe that to society in general.
Yeah, and I'll say one more thing on this. I think about some people are deceived by FDA by in their end of phase discussion. You can be misled into thinking that they totally agree with what you're planning to do. Most of the time, their focus is on patient safety. They do care about some of these products very much, and they will help those groups. You can see the difference in engagement with the agency versus something where they care quite a bit less. But they're under no obligation to fully help you develop your product. Your job as the sponsor, as the person owning the product, is to develop the product and bring a plan to them. So getting that in place, getting agreement with it, it can be hard to get agreement until you actually have data. That's part of the piece that you have to develop. That's where the risk is. And that's ultimately when you get the best feedback, when you go to the agency with data in hand to ask them, what should we do now? Or not to ask them, what should we do now? To propose your plan and allow them to respond to it.
Yeah, I think if you're misled in interactions with FDA, you're not asking the right questions, or you're not paying attention to what FDA is saying, Joseph. But you know, we've seen, you know, symptoms of that. But again, it is a matter of FDA can only react to data when all is said and done, and if they don't believe that you have sufficient data to support a proposal, they're going to say no, we don't agree. Um, we need more data. And that's where I think a lot of sponsors run into challenges in oncology development and other development domains, is that they don't pay attention to that and understand that's FDA telling them they're not ready for the next phase of development, for example.
Excellent. Thank you. Our next question asks, do you see a role in patient-centric surveys, such as quality of life, activities of daily living, or risk tolerance, as a tool in approval packages?
Maybe I can take a first stab at that before my wiser and smarter regulatory colleagues answer. I think from a clinical perspective, absolutely yes. Years ago, nobody cared in oncology about quality of life. Why? Because patients died, because we didn't have effective therapies. And clearly, quality of life has taken on a much greater emphasis in the management of oncology patients, and that's a fantastic thing. But that's been an evolution, not a revolution. Quality of life assessments for patients on clinical trial are critically important and can help you in terms of your approval process. However, I think it's important that those quality of life assessments be statistically proven tools, that they be reproducible, and that those be discussed as part of the package moving forward with the FDA. I think those are welcome by patients. I think they're welcome by clinicians, and they will go a long way towards removing the stigma of oncology therapy, where we're hurting patients more than we're helping, because that's not the case. Gentlemen?
Yeah, Mark, I was going to say I agree with you 100%. You know, again, FDA over the past several decades has placed a lot more emphasis on, you know, patient-centric considerations and on patient-reported outcomes as part of sort of the full package of clinical outcome assessments, and they have a key role to play in terms of assessment of the impact of new treatments for oncology as much as any other therapeutic area. Perhaps even more so in terms of thinking about the quality of life of these patients as they undergo treatment for their cancers. Is that going to be the endpoint that gets a product approved? No. Is it an important component demonstrating the effectiveness of a treatment? Yes. If you're using a validated instrument to assess quality of life, if you're using appropriate tools to assess, you know, the patient-centric considerations here, then FDA pays attention to that as they look at a product, and it is part of their review. It's part of what they'll accept in a filing. Is it going to end up in a label? Probably not, unless you have confirmatory data, typically, et cetera, et cetera. But can it help convince FDA to approve a product as long as you also have the typical endpoints that they would expect, either under surrogate endpoints for accelerated or you know, overall survival for a more traditional approval? Yes, these are very important tools in the development program.
I agree, and I think actually with targeted therapies, the idea of activities of daily living combined a little bit with tolerability is becoming even more important, because we have these approaches that were more, you know, throw chemicals at it, the patient's throwing up sick all the time, but now we have these targeted therapies that have a much safer profile, and part of that can be used to offset. Let's say you, and I'm curious, this is a strategy, but you could offset, you know, show a similar level of you know, if you're comparing to that sort of therapy, show a similar level of effectiveness with a much better tolerability profile. I could imagine that being something that FDA pays attention to.
Excellent. Thank you. We have a few more minutes left, so I think we do have time for one more question here. We discussed this during the main presentation, but once accelerated approval is achieved for a new oncology product, what are the expectations around full approval? How do we mitigate risk early to ensure full approval is achieved?
So on this one, we've touched on it some. Again, the gold standard is often overall survival. That's what FDA is looking for, particularly for diseases where that's appropriate. But as Mark was pointing out, progression-free survival may be appropriate. I was looking at a label recently where they focused on overall survival, and in order to actually proceed beyond accelerated approval to full approval, they just continued to look at overall survival and duration of effect. And their duration of effect was so long that they didn't even report overall survival at that stage. They just continued to report that, and FDA let them move to full approval. And Mark, I'm wondering if you have any other examples like that, because I think it sort of depends.
Yeah, I think so. I think it depends, but of course it depends. For instance, I think one of the diseases that I was involved with in practice was colorectal cancer. And colorectal cancer a decade ago underwent a tremendous convulsion in terms of therapy, and changes were occurring extremely rapidly. And what became clear was that as we brought in biologic agents and more active agents, that there started to become a very strong correlation between progression-free survival and overall survival. And a couple of years ago, a group of very senior colorectal oncologists published a paper, again, which sort of functioned as a position paper, saying that PFS so strongly correlates with OS in the metastatic colorectal space that it may be an effective surrogate in terms of approval. The survival advantage endpoint of overall survival becomes more muddied, and maybe Joseph and Kevin, you could comment about this. As you have multiple lines of therapy and multiple combinations and perturbations of therapy, as is occurring in many solid tumors now, trying to understand the overall survival role of a single agent can become a very difficult thing to tease out if you have a patient who's going on to 4 or 5 or 6 lines of treatment. So the progression-free survival in those situations may become a very important endpoint for full approval. Again, that's a very indication-specific question and would require, I think, an ongoing dialogue with the FDA before you get to that point, before you come up with that kind of a result. Kevin, Joseph, thoughts on that?
Well, Joseph, I'll ask you first.
Yeah, I mean, you have to understand the baseline of the disease, and there are several ways to do that. If often, it depends on what sort of cocktail you've produced. So if you have if you're looking at 4 different products and you've added one on top of that, do you know the background of those 4 products together? Because I wouldn't necessarily want to move to 5 new agents all at once, So theoretically, you would base some of that on the historical rates that you'd observed for the other 4 chemicals or whatever you're using, and plan around that for your agent. That's what's on my mind. I can't, again, putting too many together at once without some proven role seems like a mechanism for failure ultimately.
Yeah. And I think part of what we're touching on here is really some of the challenges. If you've gone through the accelerated approval pathway, the expectation is that you're going to do a confirmatory study to show that ultimately you have an impact on the right clinical endpoint, clinical outcome, which is typically overall survival. And I just want to make the observation: there's a lot of review papers out there that have looked at this, but something like a third of the oncology products that have gone down the accelerated approval pathway fail in terms of demonstrating overall survival in confirmatory studies. So that undermines, quite frankly, the initial approval in the first place. Now is FDA going to go back and force those products off the market? We don't know yet. They haven't done so necessarily at this point, but it is a challenge, right? I mean, you have to fulfill these post-marketing requirements to demonstrate in a confirmatory study that your drug works, and it's challenging for oncology products to do that for some of the things that you're outlining, Mark.
Fantastic. Thank you. I would like to thank our speakers, Mark, Kevin, and Joseph, for a great discussion today. We appreciate you sharing your insights and expertise with us. And I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us today. If you did ask a question during our Q&A that we didn't get to, please know that someone will respond to you via email. And also this webinar will be available on demand in case you'd like to review anything that was discussed today. We hope to see you again soon. Have a great day.
Thank you, Megan.